Months ago, it was widely reported that Jordan Peterson was moved to tears upon hearing that he was the inspiration for the villain of the 2022 thriller Don't Worry Darling, filmmaker Olivia Wilde choosing him because he is, in her words, a hero to the incel community.
Is that you? Are you the intellectual hero to these people?
Peterson responded emotionally because he felt it was cruel to be villainized for standing up for the disenfranchised. The story provoked pundits and commenters to argue about the typical Peterson talking points, but not a lot of attention was paid to how the movie adapted Peterson's persona, or if Peterson's positions contributed to the movie's plot in any significant way. I, for one, expected it to be purely aesthetic, that maybe Chris Pine would emulate Peterson's diction, mannerisms, or fashion sense. But, well, I finally got to see the movie, and to my surprise, Peterson's influence on the premise of the film is undeniable. Some of Peterson's most well-known assertions are germane to the critique that this social horror film espouses. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that if Jordan Peele's Get Out dramatizes concepts of black thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois and Frantz Fanon, Don't Worry Darling is just as much a dramatization of some of the perceived positions of Jordan Peterson, and there's little doubt this film is very much a wannabe Get Out. However, things get a bit weird. In trying to condemn what Peterson represents, the film ends up actually being quite, Petersonian, if we may use that term. Now, in order to break it all down, I'm going to have to go into heavy spoiler territory, but I promise you, the movie is quite mediocre, so I don't think you're missing much. Also, this video is a collab with Mr. Beat, so click the link in the description if you want to see him and I analyze the Kubrick classic Full Metal Jacket. Anyway, Don't Worry Darling takes place in your typical Stepford Wives setting. It's the pseudo-50s, the nuclear family is omnipresent, and everybody is happy. Too happy. We follow married couple Alice, played by Florence Pugh, and Jack, played by Harry Styles. The community is led by the enigmatic, cult leader-esque Frank, our Jordan Peterson stand-in, who emphasizes, above all, the importance of maintaining order and casting out chaos. Alice starts noticing things aren't right in the community and starts asking questions, and, of course, discovers that there's something sinister underneath this apparent utopia. What is it? Well, apparently it's all a simulation. The real world is 15 minutes in the future where a significantly less dapper Jack lives an alienated life of unfulfilling desk work, while Alice works brutal hours at a hospital, making her so exhausted that it's impossible to partake in a fulfilling relationship with Jack. The simulation is marketed to these disaffected men who, if they decide to join, must choose a romantic partner, and this partner has no say as to whether or not she wants to join. The film even suggests that there doesn't need to be a pre-existing relationship. A guy can just pick a random girl and she'll be kidnapped, her memory wiped, and put into the simulation to live in the Stepford Wives with her Prince Charming. Unlike the women, the men maintain knowledge of the false reality, because when they leave for work every day, they're actually exiting the simulation to grind in the real world so they can afford to stay in these sort of 50s. When Alice figures out that she's been inserted into a false reality against her will, she asks Jack why. Why did he rob her of agency? To which Jack responds, because she was clearly miserable with her job, and this Leave It to Beaver life is what she requires to be happy. Alice disagrees, kills Jack, and escapes the dream world. The end. So yeah, this film is pretty much a veritable greatest hits of Jordan Peterson's most hysteria-inducing positions. Now before I go through them, small disclaimer, I'm not suggesting these are his most impactful or important positions, nor am I suggesting they are completely in line with Peterson's intended meaning. Considering the words Wilde has used to describe him, it's certainly possible that she's not interpreting his work through the most charitable of lenses. I would imagine that she's reacting to the sensationalized versions that hit headlines and generate online outrage. Maybe there's more nuance to Jordan that she's deliberately omitting, maybe there isn't. Subject for another video. Anyway, the first concept that is pure Peterson is his assertion that feminism has made women feel inadequate unless they have a career, and that some of these women would be happier staying at home raising a family.
The idea that most 19-year-old women are fed, which is that their career will be the primary purpose of their life, is actually a lie.
Just as some accuse Peterson of suggesting that women are too compromised by ideology to make decisions that are in their best interest, Jack robs Alice of the ability to choose work, tells her that she was miserable, and that domestic life would lead to her fulfillment. Secondly, Peterson is quoted as having said that men represent order while women represent chaos.
Metaphysical or symbolic representation of chaos as feminine, well, that's a very complex problem. And
now, here Peterson is doing his Jung thing. He's interpreting archetypes in classical and religious mythology, not literally saying that women are chaotic and men are orderly. That, plus the title of his best-selling book, amounts to a villain who says chaos almost as many times as that one Final Fantasy trailer,
chaos, like chaos is chaos,
and promotes taking away female agency as necessary to maintain an orderly and therefore pleasant life. Lastly, Peterson is widely cited as arguing for the necessity of enforced monogamy. The notion is that many of the disaffected, lonely men of the modern world would be more fulfilled and less likely to lash out if society were more strictly organized around monogamy. Less hookups on Tinder, more building a culture that celebrates, supports, and rewards commitment. Now, of course, the words enforced monogamy have invited all kinds of sensational interpretations of an authority that literally distributes women to frustrated men, which is exactly what the movie depicts. Real-world Jack is scruffy, nappy, and computer-bound, only a neckbeard away from a stereotypical depiction of an internet incel who gets to claim Alice as his VR wife, whether or not they're in a real relationship. Now, it's important to note that just because Don't Worry Darling is building off of Jordan's ideas and weaving them into the plot of a horror movie, that doesn't mean the film is literally saying that Peterson is taking away female agency. Peterson isn't actually saying, for example, that men need to steer women away from the pressures of feminism so that they can be domesticated and experience happiness. Art can borrow things from real life without necessarily making implications about them. But what really bothers me about this social horror film is that it makes some of the same mistakes in its social critique that many in the Olivia Wilde side of the culture war accuse Peterson of making. For one, if Peterson is suggesting that the silver-tongued ideology of feminism is convincing women to make bad choices that lead to social dysfunction, then Wilde is suggesting that the silver-tongued ideology of Jordan Peterson is doing the same to men. It's speaking to their perceived toxic entitlement and convincing them to make decisions that hurt women. In both cases, there's a sense of you know not what you do finger wagging. You think you're doing what's best for you in society, but you're actually blinded by a pernicious ideology that results in a harmful status quo. If it's ridiculous for Peterson to claim that women are too ideologically compromised to reject feminism, then is it not also ridiculous to claim that men are too ideologically compromised to reject Peterson? But secondly, and perhaps most ironically, Wilde is doing the same thing that a lot of people on the left accuse Peterson of doing, attributing the adoption of supposedly toxic ideologies to individual moral failings instead of asking, what are the social factors that led to these ideologies' appeal? Basically, rather than looking at larger, oftentimes obvious structural concerns that can illustrate why men and women feel desperate and miserable, Peterson and Wilde attribute this pain entirely to a lack of nobility and effort. Don't Worry Darling is essentially operating under the logic of Peterson's most famous quote, "Clean your room."
The one sure route to aiding the world is to clean up your existential space. First of all, you're not telling anyone else what to do. That's a big plus.
Many on the left interpret this to mean don't focus on the structural issues leading to your misery because you can't change them. Focus on advancing your life instead of criticizing the world around you. Now, when pressed on this point, he'll often say that he's not suggesting one ought not criticize society, just that one ought to get their life in order before they decide to criticize the world.
I'm suggesting that people who don't have their own houses in order should be very careful before they go about reorganizing the world.
Now, fair advice, but it's not quite clear at which point you're sufficiently responsible enough to criticize society, which is partly why the leftist critique persists. If, like Peterson suggests, resentful, loud people on Twitter shouldn't be afforded the context of greater social implications that lead to their life states,
I'm not in favor of resentment at all. I think that if you're resentful, something's definitely wrong. Either you need to grow the hell up and take stock of your life.
then neither do the men in Wilde's world, because as they're depicted in the movie, they are toxic and they are entitled, and it doesn't matter why. Peterson might say that Olivia Wilde is painting a very unsympathetic portrait of these modern, disaffected, lonely men, and he would be absolutely right. She doesn't provide any context for why men feel this way. There's no recognition that society may be organized in a way that doesn't prioritize their thriving. No sense that the intense despair that would make the simulation seem appealing is a tragic externality of larger organizational issues. The pressures leading to Jack's soul-crushing existence and the exploitative working conditions that keep Alice constantly exhausted ought not be questioned, because the bad guy is Jack and the other men for making the wrong moral choice to enter the simulation. The sympathy stops there at individual choice. This is a common critique of Hollywood films, especially ones of the toothless anti-corporate variety. You know, movies like Avatar, which depicts a corporation destroying an entire native population in order to pursue a natural resource. Now, it's not the fact that capitalism relies on constant growth and therefore relentless expansion that's to blame. It's just the immoral decisions of the people who run the corporations. Pretty much all evil corporation Hollywood movies stop their analysis at the individual decisions of the people in charge, and not how the organization of society urges, if not mandates, these decisions. Now, granted, this point needs to be taken with a grain of salt, because again, movies are not political pamphlets, but Don't Worry Darling is specifically a social horror film, so I think this critique is warranted. Plus, vague power structures make for a much less captivating villain than a single corrupt individual. Now, there are movies that point to a larger structural critique like Snowpiercer, Network, or The Matrix 2 and 3, but well, one only needs to rewatch those Matrix sequels to realize how much this kind of critique can burden the pace of an action film. Not impossible to do well, but definitely difficult. Now, I also just want to add here that I do find value in stressing individual responsibility a la Peterson. It would be crazy not to, but it requires a balance because it is possible for your environment to limit your ability to thrive. Only stressing individuality allows for larger societal injustices to go unchallenged, and only focusing on a social critique too conveniently absolves us of any responsibility. So again, a balance. But whereas Peterson might point to feminism or hookup culture or the excesses of wokeness for the misery of men, and Wilde may suggest that it's just that men under the influence of Jordan are toxic, both positions are ignoring glaring issues that lead to this misery in our generation. Namely, and this should be surprising to absolutely nobody, that we live in very economically precarious times. According to a 2019 Pew study, among people in relationships that haven't gotten married yet but want to, they cite economic concerns as the primary limiting factor. They're worried about healthcare costs, education costs, childcare costs, not enough paid leave, etc. So to Olivia, I would say maybe the 50s aesthetic that your movie portrays isn't appealing to men because it was a time when they were keeping women down. Maybe it's because things like higher education and owning a home were affordable for middle-class families. And to Jordan, I would say, maybe it's not feminism or the dim forms of wokeness and cancel culture that are leading to our rooms and our lives being in disorder. Maybe people would be less socially anxious and more willing to commit if the material conditions of our lives were arranged so stability could be within reach for average people. But alas, if there's one kernel of thought that's consistent among left-wing discourse, it's the Frederick Jameson quote that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism. If changing our material conditions or rehabilitating or evolving past capitalism through democratic efforts is hopeless, then maybe Peterson and Olivia Wilde are correct, and that the only site of improvement that we have in our lives is individual choice in our hopelessly static society. Maybe the endless tumult of outrage porn ideology wars on the internet and through cinema is the best we can do to guide people to lead more fulfilling lives. I guess it all depends on what you look to your art and your gurus to provide. Is it the tools to do the best within the world that we have, or the tools to imagine a better world? I at least try to aim for the second. Thanks for watching, guys, and don't forget to click on the link in the description to check out history guru Mr. Beat's second channel, The Beat Goes On, where he gives awesome historical and social analyses of pop culture artifacts like movies, bands, albums, and much more. I'm actually guest starring in his newest video, giving an analysis on the Kubrick classic Full Metal Jacket, so be sure to check it out. Mr. Beat is a stand-up guy. I've always been fond of him as a person and as a content creator, and he actually has some of the best streams in the education space, so be sure to subscribe to all of his channels and all of his socials. Also, be sure to hit me up on Twitch. The link is in the description. I love playing games on Twitch with the community. Join the Discord. Really appreciate you guys and hope you have a great new year. Peace.